Welcome. I'm Gigi Dopico, Interim Provost of NYU, and it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, the second event in the In Dialogue series. In the spirit of dialogue, I'm going to ask you to start by please introducing yourself briefly to the person next to you and share with them why you're here. All right, now I'm going to be school-marmish and interrupt your dialogue, sorry about that, to begin our program. A conversation on academic freedom. There is no more pressing issue in higher education today. It is the bedrock principle on which American universities are founded, but one that is the subject of heated debate, a debate at the very heart of critiques of higher education. It is one of the most fraught questions universities have faced in recent years, and especially in the aftermath of October 7th, is how to vigorously defend academic freedom while ensuring that our campuses are free from any sort of bias or discrimination. To help us explore these questions, I'm especially honored to introduce you to two remarkable legal scholars. First, our wonderful moderator, Samuel Issacharoff, the Bonnie and Richard Reiss Professor of Constitutional Law here at NYU. Sam is a leading expert in the study of democracy, constitutions, and the courts. He served as a senior legal advisor to the presidential campaigns of Barack Obama. He also has deep experience as an appellate advocate in the American courts. Sam is widely published on topics including democracy and populism. His most recent book is Democracy Unmoored, Populism and the Corruption of Popular Sovereignty, and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please join me in welcoming Sam. Sam will be in conversation with a special guest, Professor Randall Kennedy, the Michael R. Klein Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. Randall teaches on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He is also a widely published scholar in areas including discrimination, racial politics, and interracial relationships. He is clerked for Judge J. Skelly Wright of the United States Court of Appeals and for Justice Thurgood Marshall of the U.S. Supreme Court. He is also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So please join me in welcoming Randall. So as is probably obvious just by looking at them, Sam and Randy are longtime friends who, however, don't exactly see eye to eye. They disagree a lot, apparently, but they model for us what it means to do so with civility, respect, and curiosity, an ethos that we hope informs every aspect of our work and studies here at NYU. Through their conversation this evening, we hope to get a better understanding of exactly what academic freedom is, where its limits may or may not be, and what is at stake for higher education in the current moment. We're grateful to have them share their expertise and to perform their disagreement in this forum so we may critically examine this complex issue from multiple perspectives. So please join me again in welcoming Sam and Randy.
Thank you for the generous introductions, and thank you to our new president, Linda Mills, for putting this together. I'm going to start because I am the home team, and so I get to pitch first. Let me just say that Randy and I have known each other for 40 plus years, and the issues that we're going to talk about tonight are the basis of a long-time intellectual friendship. We were students many years ago in a course on freedom of expression taught by Owen Fiss, and the two of us and our then classmate, my current wife and colleague at NYU Law School, Cindy Estlin, the three of us used to go across the street after class and argue and talk for hours. And it was some of my fondest memories of being a law student, being engaged in ideas. And so it's a great pleasure to be able to revisit that with a little more senility, a little more perhaps humility, but you'll see that that's not the problem. But it's great to be back to this. So Randy, let me just start by asking the following. You're on the board of a group called the National Coalition Against Censorship. And on the group's website, they proclaim that they are the first responders on the critical issues of censorship and expression. Notice, rarely do you see the group say, we bring up the tail, you know, we're the last in line, but you're the first responders. And so first responders, by definition, have to triage, right? They have to say what's important, what's not. So why don't we start by telling us what you think is important in this domain?
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the National Coalition Against Censorship. They are a scrappy freedom of expression group, and I like them a lot. I'm happy to be associated with them. I'll just say that there was a period of time in which I really wasn't part of such groups, but over the last 5 years, I've joined every civil liberties, freedom of expression, freedom to teach, freedom to listen group that I can get my hands on, because I think we are really, as a culture, in peril. Now, to answer your question, the thing about National Coalition Against Censorship, when they say that they're first responders, when their staff hears about some difficulty, some problem, they go right to it. They go, they talk with the people who are in conflict, and they try to solve an issue, solve a problem, solve a conflict on the ground. They do all sorts of things. They lobby, they petition, they talk with the people, like I say, who are in conflict. Sometimes they engage in litigation, though that's not their preferred mode of approach. With respect to academic freedom, I was introduced to the National Coalition Against Censorship when a member of their staff came to my home law school and was talking about issues involving censorship at museums, and how they were trying to deal with this problem of censorship of museums. I'll just say one other thing I really like about the National Coalition Against Censorship. They focus on government. When government is when government is encroaching on freedom of speech or freedom of listening or freedom of teaching. But they're also very attentive to private power and the way in which private power can encroach on these freedoms as well. So they are attentive to the way in which we have to be watchful of, frankly, any entity that has power. Well, power can be good. You can use power in a good way. But power also, and whoever has the power, power can also be a bad thing. There's always the tendency of people to use their power to shut things down that they don't like.
So let me push you on one thing, Randy, right from the start, which is you use the word entity, and that kind of assumes one question that I want to spend a little time on, if we can, which is, what's the source of, if you want to call it sensorial power? Where does it come from in our society? Now, the classic vision of that is that it's the state, because it is the big kahuna of entities out there, right? It's the one. So that our image in the First Amendment is the policeman's billy club silencing a speaker at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, or some such equivalent. And so I've been, we've both been teaching for decades now. I spent the first decade of my career at the University of Texas, which is a state institution where the state legislature of Texas has never met a social issue that they don't want to do something terrible with, and including, the expression in the university, including academic freedom, including going after some of my colleagues and so forth. On the other hand, I also have been on the faculty at Columbia and then here, and I don't know that I see a great deal of difference in the freedom of expression that exists in the university, whether we're in the public sector where the entity is most obvious, whether we're in the private sector where it's filtered in various ways, and whether it comes from just the homogeneity of political views that tend to be found in the academy, and all these kinds of things. So I'm gonna, it's comfortable to talk about the entity and talk about, that classic cop breaking up the rally and all that. I don't think that corresponds to how my life has been, how I've experienced it in my life. And maybe Harvard, you have more police brutality in your classroom than we do here, but what do you say to this?
Well, it was said at the beginning that you and I don't see eye to eye sometimes, so here we go. I think that historically, people who are interested in freedom of expression have focused on the menace of state power, and they are right to focus on the menace of state power. And if you ask me now, for people in higher education, what is the main thing that you need to be concerned about? Government. So yesterday, I was on talking with the University of Texas Faculty Senate. A year ago, Texas legislature passed a law, SB 17, telling all institutions of higher education, all public institutions of higher education in the state of Texas, you cannot have any organization, any program, anything with DEI associated with it. So the Texas just wiped out, the legislature wiped out DEI. Now, listen, I think that there's criticisms to be made of, various, DEI programs and DEI initiatives, just like there's problems with everything. But here we have a situation in which a legislature, mainly for, political reasons, partisan political reasons, reached into higher education in Texas and wiped out DEI. My home institution, so that's a public school. My home institution, Harvard University, is currently facing subpoenas coming from a committee of the United States House of Representatives, which is clearly aimed at embarrassing, humiliating, and intimidating Harvard University for ideological/political reasons. At this point, that's already taken a toll but things could get a lot worse. All of our institutions of higher education, public and private, get money from the federal government. Now, it may very well be the case, one doesn't know. We're in 2024. We are in 2024. It may very well be the case that by the end of this year, the situation will be that political forces in Washington, D.C. are aligned in a way such that they tell institutions of higher education, public and private, either do this or don't do this, or we're going to cut off the money. Now, that has never, higher education has never faced such a concerted attack as now. And then that's from government. I'm not. There are other issues too. There's the, there is the problem of, peer pressure and sort of informal conformity, and that can be a problem. But at this moment, the specter of government encroachment is the major problem.
That's an empirical statement, and you may be right. I hope you're not. I'm originally from Argentina, and let me just assure you there's a long way that you can move in the direction of government control, including when the tanks are parked at the entrance to the university. But there's certainly more of that. There's certainly more attempts. My personal sense is that a lot of it is showboating for public purposes. You hold a hearing, so you raise your profile as a public official. How much follow through there has been is still unclear to me. But I'll take your point that we live in more menacing times in this regard. But we also live in a time where we increasingly have demands from students, from faculty, to silent speech of all kinds, from not as a result of governmental pressure, but as a result of initially a sense of protecting students from ideas that they are not comfortable with. And we've known each other long enough to know that neither one of us ever wanted to be protected from ideas, including from each other. And so does that factor in at all? I mean, there's something odd going on that score also.
Sure, and yes, and for a while, I think that there have been real problems in our domain. I mean, we both teach in law schools. So we have a situation in which in some law schools, students have complained about reading certain cases and have petitioned the administration to put pressure on teachers to avoid reading certain cases. The case that, immediately I think about, of course, Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1858, the Supreme Court of the United States holds that black people cannot be citizens, federal citizens, cannot be citizens of the United States. Horrific. And, there have been cases in which students have said, this really hurts our feelings. This really singes our sensibilities. Please don't read this, don't have us read this case. I mean, frankly, I find it hard to even, are you serious or is this a parody? Of course you need to read such a case. And to the extent that, I think it is a problem that students have been, in some places, encouraged and empowered to make, that case. Now, students should be able to, students should be able to petition, should be able to make their arguments, fine. I have no problem with that. But professors ought to be able to respond, and respond fully, and respond without any fear of people saying, gosh, you've hurt my feelings more. I think that there are some real problems that have arisen from a misplaced sensitivity. I think that that's changing, by the way. I mean, this has been going on for a while, and frankly, what I think is happening, I think that people have learned. And I think that one thing that people have seen, for instance, is ideas are funny. Ideas are really quite infectious. So that people who 10 years ago were saying, certain books, certain ideas ought to be repressed. Why ought they be repressed? They ought to be repressed because, in our view, they are racist. 10 years ago, I heard people say that straight out. Time goes, and then you have state legislatures say, we want to pass a law saying that certain things cannot be taught because we view them as racist. What do we view as racist? We view CRT, we view critical race theory as racist. We view the 1619 Project as racist. Therefore, it should be repressed. I have friends who 10 years ago say, whoa, these ideas are funny things. They catch on. And I think, what's been happening in the past few years is that certain ideas that came from a certain political source have been taken in by the very adversaries of the initial source and have been flipped. And in my view, actually, what's going on now is, at least in some quarters, a real reconsideration and new appreciation for rather old-fashioned liberal ideas about freedom of expression for everyone, including ideas that you might find thoroughly objectionable.
Well, I hope you're right about that. I mean, that's you've always been more optimistic than I am, and so I hope you're right about that. But I think that there's one issue which you identify, which is this pervasive thing in American political history of the kind of the ideological flips, that ideas get taken up by one side and then appropriated by the other, and then we see it on things in the political, legal domain. Who's in favor of federalism at any given point depends whose ox is getting gored at any given point at the national level and at the state level. But there does seem to be and maybe you're identifying the counter-current now, but there was a unifying theme of protecting people from ideas. Ideas are injurious, and that seemed to be a unifying feature. We teach and we get student evaluations, and I just for the first time got a student evaluation, out of a class of 100 people. It's not statistically significant, but it's interesting. For the first time, I got one that said, I should have given trigger warnings for my lectures in class. What should I have given trigger warnings on? I taught a case about, not Dred Scott, an auto accident. And people have all sorts of experiences in life, and maybe they're not prepared to deal with an auto accident because it may have been part of their home experience. And I thought to myself, I can see that all sorts of things are traumatic based upon your personal experience. But if you can't read a case about auto accidents, maybe you shouldn't be a lawyer. Maybe you don't belong in law school. You gotta toughen up. You gotta learn how to read about Dred Scott. You gotta learn how to read a rape case if you're gonna be a criminal defense lawyer. You gotta learn how to engage the ideas of the other side at their best level. And that's something that, we've been friends for a long time. And one of the reasons is that we're both old-fashioned Enlightenment type folks, which is a dying species. I think we might be the last generation that even knows what the Enlightenment was. But this sense of protecting from ideas, and then also that the consequences of ideas can be so harmful that we should err on the side of shutting it down. That was the current. You're saying that it's ebbing, but that certainly was the current at both the public domain, at the public level, and the private level. And there was a certain synergy between the two.
I think there was that. I think there was something else. And since you've, I would assume that in an audience like this, there would be, at some point we're going to subside and there'll be time for, questions, comments.
Oh,
and
by the way, you have cards. I was supposed to tell you that, and Randy stole my line. But please write down questions and we'll take them at the end.
Well, in an audience like this, talking about this, I'm sure, there'll be some objections. And, I agree with what you just said about the way in which trauma and the language of trauma has really just grown and grown and grown. One problem, of course, with accommodating that is that one can incentivize it. And one thing that I've seen, and some of the most volatile debates I've had with people, and with students particularly. So a student will say they feel a certain way. And because of the way they feel, I should adjust. And I say a couple things. One thing is, well, I want to ask you about your feeling. And my sense is that people really get upset by that. The response I often get is, you can't, how dare you question me about my feeling? How dare you question me? And I said, knock it off. What are you talking about? People use feeling all the time. It may be, you say that you feel traumatized. Maybe you are. On the other hand, maybe you say that you feel traumatized because you know that in the current setting, that is a good way to put somebody back on their back foot. I say that I'm traumatized. If you're a well-brought-up person, the other person is supposed to back off. And, I say, maybe you're saying this for strategic reasons. I know plenty of people who have used all sorts of reasons to, get their way. And in my view, part of what's going on politically, and I'm not casting aspersions. I think this is just sort of people want to get their way. And one way in which to get your way is to is to engage in, types of victimhood and using the status of victimhood to, launch an offensive campaign. One has seen that. I mean, it's not, again, it's been done. Mowing has been done in various ways. And I think it is part of, what's going on today. If one really wants to, let's, again, if we're going to talk, let's talk. So at least in my view, a few years ago, in the aftermath of, in the George Floyd moment, the allegation of racism was made in institutions of higher education. Is there racism in institutions of higher education? Yes. Yes, schools are, in the United States of America. Of course there's going to be, some racism, but my sense was that allegations of racism were being put to a strategic campaign to, get certain things that people wanted. I think the same thing, by the way, is going on now. Again, I'll just go back to my institution. So it is said that at Harvard University, anti-Semitism is rampant. I dispute that. And in my view, the allegation is being used, not by everyone. I'm sure that, first of all, I'm sure that there is some anti-Semitism, and any is terrible. I'm sure that some people feel authentically aggrieved. But I'm also pretty sure that, there's some people who view this as, a good way of pushing a line that can be pushed and pushed effectively, by making the allegation.
And for which there's no rebuttal.
There is a rebuttal.
Well, the
there
rebuttal's empirical, and so you never win that debate.
Yeah, but I think there is a rebuttal, and I think that people ought to rebut if they are so minded. So, for instance, again, and I take it that we're, that this is a true talk. And I say that, by the way, because I've been part of talks where actually people said they wanted to talk, but they really didn't want to talk. They wanted to get together, and they wanted to sort of seem like they were talking, but they wanted to have a discussion without friction. They wanted to have a discussion in which nobody was going to feel that somebody had really gone off in the wrong direction. I don't think, I think that if we're going to talk and talk about things that matter, people ought to really lay it out there. And, lay it out there in such a way that somebody says something, you say, you're wrong, and you're wrong for the following 3 reasons. And it may very well be that the person 10 minutes before says, you made a good point. I take that back. But you don't even get to that point without you really laying it out there. And so my sense is that, this is a setting where people really want to talk. We're talking about freedom of expression in higher education. And in March of 2024, this question of, anti-Semitism on campuses is a real issue that ties in with a number of the, major conflicts that confront, students confront professors, confront administrators. So let's talk.
So I just came back from giving a series of lectures in Germany under the unprovocative title of "Is This America's Weimar?" And one of the themes was, we have more demagogic right-wing political activity. We have more open anti-Semitism than I've ever seen in my time in the United States. We have this, we have that. And then I said, but let's get real. It's not a defining feature, compared to everything in the German experience in the 1920s, and then talked about the frailty of institutions, which link the two together. But it was very interesting in a German setting to take on the anti-Semitism question. This is serious, but it's not at the level that it is the defining feature of our body politic at this point. But there is a flip side to this, Randy, and this is something I was thinking about in preparing for this, and I actually don't know what you're going to say on this, we haven't talked about this ever before. There is a part of the current political culture on campuses and elsewhere that one should face no accountability for ideas, that it is wrong to be held accountable, it is wrong to be publicized. You see student protests, I don't know how prevalent it is, but you see it certainly on YouTubes of it, in which the students are masked as they try to shut down speakers and so forth. And there is, I'm of mixed views on this. The Federalist Papers were written pseudonymously, and there is a long tradition of protecting dissident political expression, particularly political expression. At the same time, we have a tradition in the United States, begun most famously with the Ku Klux Klan Act after the Civil War, that forbids marching on a public highway with a mask on, precisely because it is intended to intimidate. And we had many state laws, I think the most recent was Georgia in the 1950s or so forth, that mimic that and that create measures of accountability. And there are campus rules at many universities, which are seemingly not being enforced right now, about not wearing masks and so forth during What's your view on that? I mean, I'll tell you, I'll just start with mine, which is that, I want to protect speech, but the purpose of speech is not that you're going to tell me your feelings. The purpose of speech is that you put out ideas and you put something behind it, which is you. And that means it's uncomfortable sometimes, and it means some private employer may not hire you. It means all sorts of consequences. And I think that there's an institutional failing in not enforcing that. What's your view on that?
I think on this one, we probably overlap. So for instance, I don't know if you've had this experience. I've had this experience on many occasions. Teach a class, student comes down, makes a comment. I say, that's an interesting comment. I wish you had said that in class. The person says, oh no, I couldn't have said that in class. Why not? Well, my classmates would have, canceled me. My response is, well, hey, nobody's sending you to the gulag. Again, it gets back to the issue of the desire to engage in conversation without friction, without somebody, you say something, somebody's going to, get in your face. It seems to me that having a real, vital conversation about things that matter will entail people getting in one another's faces. Now, this raises an issue, and here's one. There comes a point, at what point does getting in somebody's face turn into censorship? So if we're talking about the government, if the police, if Officer Friendly, has the billy club and puts handcuffs on you and puts you into the paddy wagon, censorship. But let's suppose you're in a different setting and you're 22 years old. You and especially now with the phones and social media and all that stuff. At what point does social ostracism become so onerous that it becomes fairly viewed as censorship? And I view that I think is a tough question. Because like I say, I think that there should be, there's going to be some degree of struggle. And if you're going to, effective advocacy does have a certain coercive quality to it. So there's always going to be some, mobilization of force. That's part of what persuasion's about. But at what point does it go over? I'm not sure about that. And I think there's a lot to be, I think it's a good subject. I think there's a lot of good articles to be written about that.
So one of the reasons that I think people like us have trouble with this is that we're both lawyers, we're both law professors, and so our recourse is, we've got doctrine. We've got hundreds of years of debates about this in the public domain, reflected in wonderful constitutional case law. But the case law is really quite unavailing, in my view, to deal with private power. Mm-hmm. And the case law is all about, ultimately, the cop at the corner and the beating up of the speaker. And you go back to the classic cases that we read, like Brandenburg. And you go back to it; it's 4 pages long. It's kind of incoherent in its argumentation. But then when you try to apply it to private institutions, you say, okay, you've got this gradation. You pick the social ostracism, but there's also the intimidation of protesters at your classroom. And then there's the disruption of speakers. Then there's, you go down the road, and the public case law is all prohibitory. It's all a negative on what the government can do. But especially in the university setting, we have a responsibility to provide a forum for ideas. And that, I think, is a different obligation, a different social mission than that of the state. Mm-hmm. So it translates poorly in my mind. I don't want to take away the point mm-hmm. you started with, that if you let the Texas legislature run the world right now, this would be a very menacing place. But at the same time, here at NYU, for example, the Texas legislature has relatively little hold over us, and the New York legislature can't organize anything so we're relatively immune here from that. So how do we think about translating the ideas that have emerged mostly in the public domain as a negative on what the state can do? We have case law, obviously, about when the state creates a public forum and things of that sort. But how do you think about the positive side of the positive liberty side of this question?
Yeah. First of all, I agree with. I pay my mortgage by teaching people about legal doctrine. So that's great, fine, but that's limited. It's very limited.
It's a stupid dog trick, but don't tell anybody,
No,
right?
it's not,
it's
no,
like,
no, I'm not going to go along with that. No, it's not a stupid, no. But it's limited. And, you know, actually much more important than law courts, you know, court of public opinion. And I think that we can see that our institutions, our educators, our administrators are wrestling with some of the very things that we're talking about. I mean, hence this meeting. I mean, people are you know, well, you know, exactly fine. We want people to debate. We understand that there's going to be conflict. At the same time, when does conflict degenerate into something that we don't want? How does one tell that? How does one structure things that we have productive conflict as opposed to destructive conflict? I think that actually people are grappling with that. I think that the legal system provides, you know, the legal system provides some hints, some lessons, but, you know, I think we're going to have to go to other sources.
Yeah, let me give a concrete example. There's a realignment politically in the United States, and so you can basically get which side of the divide you're on by how much education you have. And we teach in law schools, which means everybody, by definition, has a college degree. So they're already on a certain side of the political distribution. One of the things that's hard in the classroom is to make it a comfortable place for people to raise ideas outside what's publicly agreed to, what's generally agreed to. And my personal view as a teacher is that it's my role at the beginning of every discussion to stake out the poles of the debate and to make the arguments at the poles of the debate so that students can feel that they're within the discourse. I found that gets harder to do over time, that that the students are much quicker to want to say something to get you in the category, and that it's a challenge to educational institutions, if you generalize from the classroom setting, to figure out how to make the poles of reasonable debate. I don't want flat Earth. I don't want racism. I don't want anti-Semitism. But I don't want all to be, the Democratic Party platform in 1968 was the highest achievement of mankind. I don't want that to be the consensus in the room. How do you do that nowadays?
I'm not sure how people do it. For me, I tend to be a bit skeptical of meta talk about talk.
What are we doing here?
No. Actually, no. We are actually talking about issues. I think that orientation. So at my school's orientation, we have about a week of orientation.
That's all? That sounded enough.
I think it's too much.
Yeah.
I think it's too long. There's a whole lot of there's a couple of sessions talk about difficult discussions. If it was me, pick an issue about which people disagree, and then discuss it. It seems to me that the best way and then see a discussion, exemplify a discussion. You can have people that disagree, and let's see what you think what is a good discussion? I can even imagine, having a couple different types of discussion and a couple of different types of talkers. There's some people who are sort of, very animated, sort of, aggressive talkers. You have some people who talk in a very different way. I could imagine, letting people, seeing how different people do things, but I don't know, I guess for me, be real. And in my classes, I must say, I haven't had much of a problem, though, I'm older. I think that has something to do with it.
I think we're exactly the same age. I think you're 2 days older than me, or I'm 2 days older than you.
And do you have a problem?
Of course. You feel the generational distance.
No, but in class, so for instance, I have colleagues who have had situations in which students have really complained in a big way about something they said, and have, said, you were being, insensitive or something, and they come to the, lunchroom, the faculty lunchroom, and they're really quite, they're on edge about it. They don't feel good about it, and they're, really this is a, real big thing. I haven't had that happen, and I'm simply saying I wonder why. I suspect that it might have something to do with age, but I'm not sure.
I think it has something to do with that. I think that if you are forthright in disagreement with the students, oddly, to this point at least, they respect that. Mm-hmm. And I tend to teach quite Socratically, as we call it in the law schools, which means a student answers a question, and I say, that's wrong, and here's why. And many of my students, it's the first time they've ever heard those words in their lives, in their educational lives. They're accustomed to, well, that's an interesting point, and that's not my style, and I suspect it's not yours, yours either. So that may have something to do with it. But let's, some of my colleagues are insensitive. I mean, there is, I started teaching at the University of Texas in 1989. And when my wife and I joined the faculty, I think she was the third woman on the faculty out of 80 or something like that. And rape was not taught because for generations it was, what was she wearing? It was radically insensitive in the way that the topic was addressed. And so my colleagues had decided simply not to teach it because it got them into trouble. And I thought that was an abdication, because for teaching criminal law, there's two elements to the criminal law. There's the subjective component, what we call the mens rea, and the objective component, the actus. Rape is the only crime where the same act is either a constitutionally protected liberty or a felony, depending upon the interaction between usually just two people, or oftentimes just two people. It's a tremendously vexing issue for the legal system for how to deal with it. And this doesn't mean you go, what was she wearing? But it also means that you can't run from it, And I think that some of my colleagues in the 30 years I've been teaching erred on both sides of that.
Yeah. I mean, one thing about this is there's complication everywhere. So on the one hand, I say that, on the one hand, I criticize people for being what I claim sometimes, overly sensitive. Sometimes I say that. On the other hand, there are things that are simply not said today that were said 50 years ago. And isn't it good that they're not said today? And didn't that come about through some of the very actions that I criticize today. So, what does one say about that? I mean, ironies abound.
But it's not just that they came about because of these actions. They came about in particular, like the example I just gave about teaching women students at the University of Texas. When we were students, we had just hit somewhere around 30% of our classmates were women for the first time.
Yeah.
Today, more than half my students are women. You wouldn't get away with that crap in the classroom at this point, rightly so. And so it's not just a matter of an imperium, of the ideas, but it's also the facts on the ground, how we've changed our institutional settings. So I think that has a lot to do with it also.
Yeah, sure. And, how did the facts on the ground change? Facts on the ground changed by people pushing and shoving and shouting and, acting in ways that, that I've criticized. But the fact of the matter is, through doing what they did, things did change. And, so all I'm saying is there is a certain irony there. Social change takes place in very complicated ways. And again, I simply want, to be alive to the irony of things. Sometimes good things happen from actions which one criticizes and actually ought to criticize.
So that's a good segue to, we have questions, and the first one is just along these lines, says, in light of, I didn't bring my glasses, but this will be more or less what this says, in light of ongoing world events and recent controversies surrounding freedom of expression, what do you see as the legal issues that are most likely to emerge, and what are the strategies around those? Understanding the paradox that you don't know what the push and pull is going to be.
Oh, I think there are many. I mean, one, a very central one is what ought people be able to say within the law? I mean, as doctrine, exists now in the United States of America, we have a regime which is really, quite extraordinary in the world. I mean, people talk about American exceptionalism. America is exceptional in the world to the extent to which it allows certain ideas to be voiced. So,
can I just say something about that? In this
ahead.
Germany lecture, I walked into a trap that it never occurred to me. I started because it's to a German audience, I always use PowerPoint because it's not a native speaking, English speaking. And so I started with a picture of Donald Trump with the furrowed brow and a quote from Trump about the poisoning of the race by immigrants and all that. And next to it, I had a picture of Adolf Hitler with the furrowed brow and a quote from Mein Kampf that was the same thing. Everybody kind of sat up for a second. Quoting and showing a passage from Mein Kampf in a German university, it's marginally illegal. There's technical issues.
Yeah.
And it just, it didn't even occur to me. I thought I was making an interesting point to then say, yeah, but it's not the same. But I want to say, but there are traces in which you can see really, it just never occurred to me that people would sit up a bit when they saw that first slide up on the above the podium.
Yeah, the wearing of the swastika, and that's can't be done now. In the United States, there's no insignia that is outside of bounds, and people can say all sorts of things. Now, my sense actually, and this, of course, a couple of months, 2 months ago, whenever the famous hearings were, really raised this to public attention. I think that there are people that are thinking, gosh, should it be the case that a person can, get up and with some degree of seriousness actually champion the idea of genocide? I think that there are a whole set of issues that I could imagine people reconsidering in our time. For me, the one I want to go back, the one that I think is hugely important for institutions of higher education has to do with how the legal system ought to deal with the federal government and its funding. And here again, we have irony. In the 1960s, the power of the federal government to turn off the money spigot was a principal way of desegregating institutions. That it served a tremendously progressive, it was a tool of racial progress. Title VI. Now, and by the way, at the time, of course, there were segregationists who said, we don't like this because doesn't this empower the federal government to act in a way that is, won't this give rise to federal tyranny? Can't the federal government sort of call the tune too much?
But there's levels to this question, Randy, because one is the spending power, the way that the case is treated, is voluntary. So as Linda Mills will tell you, every day at NYU, we consider whether to stop taking federal money altogether for any of our programs, right? And then we could be a small community college and back to our roots. But these are just, so there's the
You were being facetious, right?
I either that or I just got fired. So there's that level. But then let's talk a little doctrine for a second. There's this famous Supreme Court case, the Bob Jones University, where they have tax-exempt status. So they're not getting federal money in, they just have tax-exempt status, but they're racist. Uh-huh. And the IRS says, no more.
Yeah.
And what do you think?
I got in a big squabble years ago with Ira Glasser about this. Ira Glasser,
head of the New York Civil Liberties Union.
Yeah, wonderful civil libertarian. We were talking precisely about this. And I was making a pitch for there being I like the idea of you have private universities, you have public universities. Public university is regulated by the Constitution directly. Private institutions, as far as I was concerned, should be able to do their own thing. And it was at this point that, Ira said, well, yeah, Kennedy, but, what about Bob Jones? And I said, okay, Ira, you push me. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. This is a huge country, 300 million people. As far as I'm concerned, if, let Bob Jones alone, frankly, is the way I view it.
But that doesn't give even that position, which is, just it's sort of out there in doctrinal terms, but even that position doesn't address the intermediate position, because Harvard, NYU, we can't live without the federal funding. It's half our budget or maybe more. And I just saw Larry Summers say, it was slightly over 50% of the Harvard budget comes from that. So I'll use that figure. At that point, it's not even a choice.
That's precisely why the struggle for public opinion is so important. That's precisely why educators in higher, the people, that's precisely why we should be appealing to the public and saying to the public why it's important for for governments to provide money to institutions of higher education and provide the money and not then seek to monitor these institutions. As far as I'm concerned, pay the money over, don't monitor them, and there is a public good from that regime. It's going to be up to us to appeal to the public to make that argument.
Every instinct in the public domain is exactly to the contrary right now.
Yes.
Everything is regulate, accountability, more oversight, more court review of every single, and some of it, you want to fund our labs, I'd like to see what our labs do. Some of it makes sense, but a lot of it is just this regulatory due process-ish that everything has to be subject to equivalent constitutional challenges if it were a public institution.
Yeah, I mean, basically, people say, pay the piper. If you're going to take our money, we get to monitor. I think that we need to respond to that.
The contrary, though, is get off it. You're a professor at Harvard. You're more powerful in the state of Massachusetts. You're more powerful than Rhode Island. You're more powerful than a lot of countries in the world. And you really want us to give you the money on top of your $50 billion or whatever it is endowment, and then hands off.
I will say this.
Pretty convenient.
I think that the past year has shown that how fragile our institutions of higher education are. They seem, in one way, this is obviously a, well-provisioned in every sort of way, whether we're talking about finances, whether we're talking about public esteem, whether we're talking about, contacts. It's a well-established, well-provisioned institution. But we've seen that even institutions like this, they are more fragile than one would think. And it's precisely because of that I think we need to, the friends of higher education need to do a better job of putting their ambassador's hat on and telling everyone, including the people who don't get the privilege of going to a place like this.
So that takes me, we're running out of time, and I want to get to another question from the audience. So let's flip that on the fragile quality of the universities and the public role they have to play. So a question, does this mean that these universities, which you want to give the money to, which you want to protect from government oversight, have a corresponding duty to provide a platform to speakers? Do they become must they assume the role of Hyde Park, of the public forum, in exchange?
No. I think it's really important for people to understand what a university is. And I think that the public understanding has been actually confused by the way in which we talk. Because we often, we use, for instance, free speech and academic freedom synonymously. We just in the newspapers, or just regular speech, we just sort of use them as if they're the same thing. They're not the same thing. Across in the park, that's a stone's throw away. You can have somebody in the park, person in the park can stand up and say 2 and 2 equals 5. And if...
That's code for a drug transaction if you're in the park across the street, but go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm a visitor. I don't know about locals. I'm gonna stick 2 and 2 equals 5. We don't, if a police officer walked up to the person and said, I'm taking you in because you are miseducating people, we wouldn't allow that. Somebody can go out there and say 2 and 2 equals 5 to their heart's content. Somebody can go over there and say that the earth is flat. Somebody can go over there and say that the sun revolves around the earth. They can say all sorts of things across the park. If they come over to NYU and you are in a math class and the student says 2 and 2 equals 5, is the teacher going to sort of say, well, everything is everything? We're chilling here. We're not going to make distinctions. No, the teacher is going to say, knock it off. And if you write 2 and 2 equals 5 on the exam, you're going to get an F. And if you get enough of those, you're going to tell you bye-bye. If somebody comes to your class over in the park, people can talk about whatever they can talk about baseball, football, anything they want. If they come to your class, your civil procedure class, and they start talking about baseball, you're going to say, thank you very much. The door is over there. Academic freedom, the university has a mission, especially a university like this university. I mean, an elite research university, the protection of knowledge, the conservation of knowledge, and the expansion of knowledge, and the dissemination of knowledge. And everything that, is done here should be aimed at those things. Just, willy-nilly people coming talking, just, people just yakking, that might be a danger to the advancement of knowledge. So I think that sometimes we freedom of speech, the university has certain purposes. It is about expertise. It's about competence. At the university, you are in a discipline. I think that's a very important word, discipline. Across the street, freedom of speech is undisciplined liberty. In the university, academic freedom, on the other hand, is disciplined liberty. It's hierarchical. This is excellent. This is okay. This is unacceptable. That's the way that universities roll. The public park rolls in a very different way, and people should understand that. I think oftentimes, however, they don't.
I think that's a great place to wrap up, because one of the things, as I said at the beginning, we've known each other a long time, and your last articulation of what I would call enlightenment, fundamental enlightenment values of knowledge advances the society has to advance through knowledge, is what we agree on. What we disagree on is some of the means by which you get there. And we have different impulses on that question. But that last statement that you made about the difference between just untethered discourse of, quote, freedom and the mission of the university is critically important because speech in the university is directional. It's toward the advancement of knowledge. It's not speech for its own sake. This is not Hyde Park with some buildings in it. This is a very different kind of enterprise. And I think we are out of time. Randy, as always, a pleasure. And thank you all very much.
Thanks, Sam.
Sam and Randy, thank you so much for what a real privilege to get to witness this conversation and disagreement. Thanks to all of you, both here and online, for joining us. And now those who are here in person, please join us for a small reception in the back. Please join me in thanking Sam and Randy again.